Episode 17, Chapter 16, The Light We Have Inside. If there had been any hope left for this dark and battered world, Luigi was watching it vanish before his very eyes. From the balcony of Kamek's tower, he had a perfect and terrifying view of the madness unfolding below. The Empress Palace had once been such a stunning sight, a walled city of spires, shining proudly as they stabbed a sky too utterly ruined to ever fight back. But that forbidding vista was rapidly crumbling, sinking tower by tower into the formless chaos of a backfired spell. Luigi saw the void often in his nightmares, but he had never believed that it would haunt his waking eyes again. Yet there it was, or near enough. In truth, the maelstrom on the horizon was a small-scale imitation, but it looked and felt enough like the real thing to make the poor man's knees go weak. He fought to be brave, gripping the platform's railing until he could pretend that his hands weren't shaking. Beside him, Lady Bao was floating silently, still trying to understand the situation.
The end of both worlds?
She asked carefully, as if she were half expecting this to all be some elaborate prank. Eventually, she seemed to accept that the threat was real, and hovered a little higher, her expression resolute.
If you've seen this magic before, like you said, then how do we stop it?
Luigi paused before answering, picking his words carefully. He wasn't eager to share stories about last time, when he had been brainwashed and fused with an engine of multiversal annihilation. If the Boo knew that, she'd never let him live it down, so he gave her the vaguest explanation he could think of.
Well, chaos magic does have one big weakness.
They shared a moment of awkward silence.
The true love thing, yes.
Bao clarified, recalling what she had learned earlier in the night. She blinked at him a few times, before breaking down into a fit of shameless laughter.
Look, I'm flattered, and you're a good friend, but there's simply no way I'd ever feel that way about you.
By now, Luigi was used to her habitual jabs at his pride.
No, the other big weakness.
He sighed, waiting blank-faced for the giggles to leave her system.
According to Old Man Merlin, this type of spell is never truly beyond control. Even in its most unstable form, the magic is always tied to the life of its caster.
Bao glanced back through the nearby window, and Luigi nodded solemnly. Far behind them, another spire fell away into the abyss, and the sound of it rippled across the doomed palace like thunder.
We either need to convince Kamek to undo the spell.
He shut his eyes and gulped, hating the words he was about to say next.
Or we'll have to kill him.
Chapter 16, The Light We Have Inside. In every Koopa's life, there comes a time when he must throw his weight behind a cause that's bigger than himself. For King Bowser, that meant swallowing his pride while his chubby arch-nemesis dragged him along on a suicide mission. This was no time to be squabbling about rank and leadership. Every turn presented a new peril, and vigilance had to be maintained. The enchanted ships had stopped falling, but the portals they had left behind were still very much a threat. They were spreading like a virus, erasing the very streets that our heroes were trying to navigate. Between the falling spires and the vanishing terrain, the build-up to this final battle seemed just as deadly as the fight itself. Bowser, Mario, and the Shadow Girl were hot on the trail of a monstrous foe, who had fled through the ruins after infusing herself with starlight. Or at least, they should have been chasing her, but Mario was leading the group in a very different direction.
Are we trying to head her off at the pass, or something?
Bowser growled, searching the horizon for the Empress' golden glow.
How the heck do you two even know where she's going?
He had been expecting a quip from Mario, but it was actually the Shadow who turned back to explain. Vanessa? No, wait, Vivian. He'd have to try and remember that.
She wants to escape this world, right?
She asked, gesturing at some vague spot in the distance, as if that would magically get the point across.
Well, when Mario and I were flying that saucer, we spotted a really big portal over that way. We're sure she's headed there.
Up ahead, the hero jumped up onto a rubble pile, and then turned back to join the discussion.
We need to get there first, but I don't think it's a normal portal,
he warned, hopping down from the blockade as Bowser smashed his way through.
That thing was a pit of pure evil. In fact, it looked almost exactly like the Void.
Well, that certainly got the Koopa's attention, even if the claim was too ludicrous to believe.
You're telling me that some chump tore that thing open again?
He snarled, trying to imagine how such a thing could have happened. No, it was impossible. Nobody could just accidentally summon the Void itself. But maybe, if enough dark portals were mashed together in a small enough space, the result would be something similar.
If the Empress wants to dive through it, I say we let her try. She'll just get herself ripped to pieces.
Mario shook his head, leaping across a small chasm as Bowser and Vivian took the long way around.
Don't forget, she has star power now,
he reminded, turning his gaze to the mist of golden dust that hung low above the battlefield.
With invincibility, she could make it through to our world. Even worse, she could end up in the space between worlds, free to slip away into any dimension she chose. We'd never find her again.
Vivian spoke up again, worry creeping into her voice.
But if she's invincible, then how are we supposed to fight back?
She was clearly trying to think up strategies, but judging by her winces, each scenario she imagined ended with the party smeared halfway across the palace.
We couldn't even beat her in her normal form. If she's really that much stronger now, she'll destroy us.
By that point, an empty plaza was coming into view up ahead, still untouched by the mayhem. It was clear that Mario intended to intercept the enemy there.
We'll have to exploit the Power Star's one weakness,
he said, elaborating when his partners looked at him in confusion.
The time limit. If we can stall the Empress long enough, then her invincibility will eventually run out. After that, the three of us can take her down like any other monster.
That was certainly a plan of sorts, but how long could they manage to keep it up?
We'd last 10 seconds.
Bowser said frankly, having faced enough star-powered foes to know how the fights usually ended.
My army can't even stall you when you've got 1 star. She's a million times bigger, and she just swallowed a whole freaking nebula. We'll just have to be creative, and keep her busy without getting hit.
Mario said, looking exhausted by the mere idea of it.
The point is, if she reaches that portal, then she's beyond our reach for good.
For Bowser, seeing the hero so ragged was strangely less satisfying than he thought it'd be.
We can't follow her, and even if we could, it would mean leaving Princess Peach and the others behind.
The Koopa King peered down a side street, to where another vortex was eroding away at a distant intersection. Chunks of the pavement were breaking loose, spiraling inward as the wormhole's magic kept them briefly afloat. Strangely, the sight reminded Bowser of his childhood, lazy days spent throwing stones into lava and watching them melt.
They'd never last very long. Not even the toughest boulders could go more than a few minutes.
Eventually, the three companions arrived in the courtyard, their arena, and perhaps the site of their last stand. In the far distance, pulsing behind the skyline, the Maelstrom's death-black aura marked the point of no return.
If she pushes us back, we'll be retreating straight into that mess,
Bowser thought, half enthralled by the echoing hiss of reality burning away.
In that case, we just can't let her gain any ground at all.
But something truly massive was approaching, and suddenly the planning phase was over. Bowser turned away from the void, listening to the low rumble of collapsing stone, and the slithering of a monster dragging its weight across the rubble. Up above, the glow of starlight was growing steadily more intense, like a hateful sun rising above the shattered city. The Koopa kept his eyes fixed on the brightest point, squinting to try and catch a glimpse of his enemy. Yet he still wasn't prepared when the first tendrils appeared, lashing out of the light to slam themselves against the surrounding spires. Those tendrils were soon followed by more, and as the hyphae began to spread out across the walls, the golden glow behind them was pierced by a pair of wrathful red eyes. Slowly, and with a vengeance, the starlit Empress pulled herself up and into view.
"You're still alive?"
she thundered, eyeing the party as she loomed titanically overhead. As each of the heroes entered a fighting stance, the Empress glanced between them with something like disappointment.
"Tell me you're joking. Do you really think you can stand in my way?"
Bowser was the first to step forward, defiant and enraged.
"Nobody's joking here, you alien freak!"
he roared, baring his claws and letting fire dance behind his fangs.
"The world beyond that portal is all mine, you hear? So keep your slimy tentacles away from it."
It was Mario's turn next, and he didn't hesitate to return the monster's glare with one of his own. It was an expression that Bowser had seen many times before, so he knew that the little ex-plumber meant business.
"If you think you can get past us, then you're in for a rude surprise. We're going to stop you right here, once and for all."
Vivian glided up beside him, her long hair blown wildly by the portal's ambient wind.
"I've seen the kind of suffering you cause,"
she called, embers escaping through her fingers as she balled her hands into fists.
"The stakes are too high for me to back down now."
In spite of their bravery, the Empress hardly even looked interested. She leaned out over them, constricting her tendrils until the stone beneath them began to splinter.
"You could have just fled, but instead you asked to die with the rest of this world."
She reared back up to her full and terrible height, pulling an arsenal of marble with her.
"Well then, so be it."
With nothing else to say, she swept her hyphae overhead like trebuchets, launching the stones down into the battlefield. Bowser stood his ground, but Mario and Vivian evaded every which way as the white meteors crashed down. Many of the boulders struck nearby buildings, breaking loose even more stone to prolong the attack further. Dust and debris fell like rain, and by the time everything had settled, the Empress had surged ahead into the foreground. Wordlessly, she slipped down from the rooftops and into the street, letting her tendrils splay out across the surrounding walls. Bowser decided that the next move was his, so he stepped forward and exhaled a stream of fire, turning his head back and forth until the path had been sealed shut by flames. Meanwhile, Mario was sprinting off down an alleyway, maybe trying to loop around for a useless direct attack. The Empress was lifting herself up, twisting her hyphae until they were pointed straight ahead. And then suddenly, with barely a gleam of warning, they ignited. White-hot beams of stellar energy burst from their glowing tips, screaming madly with power as they swept erratically across the plaza. Bowser's eyes went wide, and he lunged aside just in time to avoid being flash-fried by a stray arc.
"What the? Is this normal shroom stuff, or some overpowered new starlight thing?"
Whichever it was, the Empress was clearly enjoying her ability, the same sick thrill that some might find in roasting punies with a magnifying lens. The cosmic lasers swept everywhere, carving trenches through the pavement as they crisscrossed the arena. Bowser retreated into his shell, refusing to give his foe the satisfaction of watching him squirm. Vivian was weaving between the beams as nimbly as she could, sometimes vanishing and reappearing somewhere else entirely. But he didn't have time to track the siren's movements. The Empress herself was a much more pressing sight. Sizzling energy had begun to bubble up from the back of her throat, wafting through her gaping maw to gather in the air before her. In seconds, she had molded a sphere nearly half the size of her own bulbous head, and easily bright enough to be called a miniature sun. It hung in the air for one blindingly ominous instant, and then the Empress' jaws snapped shut, and the ball of plasma was sent blazing across the battlefield, straight towards the stupefied Koopa King. There was no place to run, nor would he if there was. All he could do was dig in his feet, glare into the light, and hope there was enough left of him to fight back when the blast finally cleared. But the obliteration never came. Instead, Mario arrived to save the day, snagging all the glory for himself. The hero leapt in front of the blast, wielding what looked like a strand of rebar sticking from a chunk of concrete. He had likely found it in the street, but in this dire moment, it passed for a suitable makeshift hammer. Either that or a home run bat, because he swung at the sphere head-on and sent it hurtling back the way it had come. It sailed away in a perfect arc, like the sun traversing the sky in hyperspeed. The Empress wasn't prepared, and she instinctively reeled back as the blast struck her hard in the chest. Even as the energy dispersed across her starlit body, the force of the impact knocked her off balance. She gave a startled wail as her tendrils flailed back to support her, their cosmic beams extinguished and forgotten. Mario was quick to ready his hammer again, but the beast didn't seem too eager to fire a second shot. Instead, she heaved herself upright and slithered to the base of a nearby spire, sputtering a rabid froth of plasma through her clenched fangs. In one fluid motion, she grappled up the wall and swung herself out into the expanse between the tower and its neighbor, climbing higher until she hung suspended between the spires like a shimmering golden spider web.
"I don't even care about ruling anymore," she taunted, her voice rising to a howl that sent tremors through the battlefield. "I'm going to avenge my people, across every timeline in which they've been slain." Delusions of a grand conquest were playing out behind her eyes, even as she hung there amidst the ruins of her second fallen empire. "I'll keep going, until every version of this wretched kingdom has been razed to the ground."
Bowser had heard it all before. Villainous speeches like this didn't faze him. He had given a similar one himself that morning, when his minions had tried to serve him a cold breakfast. Just now, he was more interested in the structural integrity of her perch. There was a gnarly-looking crack running across the right-hand spire, likely caused by a saucer impact.
"I'll bet if we could knock one of her attacks back into that, the whole thing would come crashing down around her."
A few yards away, Mario seemed to be working his way towards the same idea. He whispered something to Vivian, who then glided off to take a position on the other side of the arena. Next, he turned his attention back to the Empress. He hopped back and forth in plain sight, trying to bait her into an attack.
"Hey, over here! Try that again, if you think you can hit me this time."
Sadly, the beast was smarter than that, and the hero's trap had been far too obvious. Instead of launching a plasma sphere, the Empress swung one of her tendrils out in a wide arc. Its laser ignited instantly, giving Mario barely enough time to leap over the beam. But he wasn't ready for what happened next. The tendril whipped up and over itself in a quick loop, bringing the laser down on Mario's head and driving him into the ground. When the light faded, there was nothing left of him at all, not even a charred denim-clad skeleton. Bowser could hardly believe his eyes. His unbeatable rival, wiped out by such a straightforward attack. The Koopa had no time to either grieve or gloat, because now the enemy's focus was back on him. The tentacle was swaying from side to side, charging up another blast, this time with Bowser in the crosshairs. He met the searing beam with a burst of his own fire breath, locking the two attacks together in a brief and blinding struggle for dominance. Mere flames would be snuffed instantly by a star-powered laser, but Bowser Koopa was no mere flamethrower. He held his ground, pushing back with all the strength he had, but in the end, the standoff tilted in the Empress' favor, and Bowser was hurled back against a wall, his aching lungs filled with stellar spray. As he slumped there, stunned, he couldn't help but focus on the taste of plasma in his mouth. Somehow, the astral energy hadn't yet cooked him alive from within. He could feel it clinging to his bones like static, and there was a dull throbbing near his tail that felt strangely familiar. But there was no time to ponder that, his vision swam in and out, but he could still make out the shape of the Empress as she loomed overhead, charging her tendril for the killing blow. But suddenly, the Haifa whipped away, and Bowser turned to see Vivian pelting the shroob with her own brand of flames. The fireballs were quite puny by the Koopa King's standards, but she was making the most of each shot, aiming for the Empress' eyes and being as infuriating as possible.
Did you forget about me?"
she called, seizing the beast's full attention for herself. The alien glowered at her, detaching from the left spire to swing a bit closer to her new target. By doing so, she was hanging all of her weight from the cracked tower, although the Empress hadn't even seemed to notice the damage. Vivian backed away warily, but there was no escaping the monster's fury now. The starlit shroob exhaled another plasma sphere, and sent it rocketing across the plaza with a bellowing roar. And that's precisely when Mario reappeared, hammer in hand, as the siren flung him up from within her own shadow. Bowser gaped, trying to clear his head enough to understand what in the world was happening.
"Did they stage that whole thing? All to trick the Empress into giving them ammo?"
If so, it had been a royally devious ploy, and the Koopa King had to resist being impressed. Mario soared upward, matching the enemy's roar with his own triumphant battle cry. He met the sphere halfway, swung like a pro, and deflected it perfectly towards the crack in the spire's wall. But the Empress still refused to be taken aback so easily. In the instant before impact, she lashed out with her nearest tendril, striking back and returning the missile to its original course. Mario barely had time to land and return the volley, and Vivian looked like she wasn't sure whether to help or stay back entirely. For the second time in a row, the Empress effortlessly flicked the sphere away. The look on her face was one of pure irritation. She didn't even know where Mario was aiming, but she wouldn't grant him the satisfaction of deflecting her attack. Meanwhile, the hero had no choice but to keep the volley going, because to miss a swing meant certain death. He sent the ball back for a third time, rather feebly, as the hammer's weight began to take its toll. By this point, Bowser had finally recovered enough to stand. Better than that, the plasma in his system had given him a totally genius idea. He was sick of watching Mario and Vivian bumble about, more concerned with their flashy combos than with getting things done. He barreled across the arena, unseen by everyone, determined to crash the party and prove once and for all that he was the biggest, baddest brute around. He shoved Mario aside just as the Empress smacked the sphere again. The stone hammer broke to pieces as the hero dropped it in shock, but that was fine, they didn't need it now. Mario and Vivian were shouting something, some panicked nonsense, but Bowser didn't bother to listen. Instead, he spread his arms wide and faced the light, laughing manically as his minions scrambled to get away. He inhaled at the very last moment, letting instinct and buried magic take command. Over the years, Bowser had been subjected to so many overlapping spells that he hardly knew what they all did anymore. But there were a few triggers that he remembered. And at least one curse that he had learned to activate at will.
Gway, ha ha ha! It's time for a feast! Vacuum shroom, don't fail me now!
In an instant, the rush of adrenaline overtook him as his gullet became a black hole. Bits of debris were sucked down in the blink of an eye, but Bowser only cared about the starlit sphere. It hovered before him, shuddering, trapped between the poles of magic and gravity. It began to unravel just as it had formed, breaking down wisp by wisp, streaming through the unhinged maw of a beast. As it shrunk away to nothing, the Kupa felt its power surging within him, coursing through his veins and sending that spot near his tail into some sort of overdrive. He nearly doubled over from the sheer intensity of it, but held his head up long enough to stare his enemy down. After that, his thoughts were lost to the red fog of rage, and he could only reel back and roar as the transformative magic took hold. It began with his horns and spikes, before spreading to the shell itself and the rest of his body in turn. The mighty Kupa King was growing mightier, swelling to giant size as his scales took on a faint celestial sheen. He thrashed about wildly, stepping mindlessly on buildings that he had once been forced to cower between. To a witness just discovering the scene, it might look like the gigantic reptile had leveled the palace by himself. When his mind finally cleared, Bowser found himself face to face with the colossal alien, glaring straight into her baffled eyes. She blinked at him once, unsure, and then she screamed as he stepped forward to dig his claws into her flesh. He gave the cracked tower a forceful kick, utterly shattering its base and letting the stone fall every which way. As her perch crumbled around her, the creature was helpless to resist as Bowser yanked her loose, gripping her by the tendrils like his own personal flail. He swung her around in a full circle, reveling in the sharp crack that sounded as he smashed her through the other standing spire. After building up some momentum, he let her go and watched as she flew through the air, crashing through the ruins and finally grinding to a halt amidst a massive cloud of dust. Bowser briefly wondered if it had been this much fun for Mario. Back during those fights the hero had won with a similar trick. Speaking of Mario, what had become of him and Vivian, anyway? Bowser couldn't spot either of them, although at his current size, he'd only see them as red and purple specks. The Koopa wasn't too bothered. In the end, they hadn't contributed much to the alliance, had they?
Forget about them,
he thought, turning back to the battle at hand.
It's been a long wait, but it's finally time for that good old-fashioned Bowsering.
The Empress sat a few streets away, for the first time showing concern. Bowser pounded his fist against his palm and grinned. It was a good start, but by night's end, he would make her show fear. Lady Bow had never spent much time thinking about mortality. It was a rather depressing subject, and it had never affected her very much anyway. But after everything that had happened in the last few hours, she found herself thinking of little else. When this adventure had begun, she hadn't been that emotionally invested. So they were trapped in another world, big deal. She'd surely find her way back home eventually, even if it took a century or two. But now, she was faced with the possibility of her mansion no longer existing, or her entire world, or even herself if this last-ditch plan failed. Did this kind of existential uncertainty plague the living every single day? If so, the feeling absolutely terrified her. For the first time, Bao was determined to give her support not because it entertained her, but because this was a fight she simply couldn't afford to lose.
What kind of Boo am I becoming?
She asked herself, listening to the muted roar of the maelstrom out beyond the tower walls.
If I'm not careful, I might find myself developing some sort of conscience.
Just now, she and Luigi were trying to locate Kamek in the cluttered labyrinth that he seemed to call home. The wizard's lair was much bigger on the inside. Bao had been expecting a modest study, but instead, she found herself wandering along the inner balcony of a seemingly endless library. Shelf upon shelf of arcane tomes towered around her, lining the walls above and below. There were more books in this enchanted space than she'd be able to read in 100 human lifetimes. The layout of this place made no sense, even to someone like her, who had a better grasp of perplexing architecture than most. What looked like alcoves became hallways on second glances, stretching away far beyond where the tower should have ended. Walkways and bridges climbed around a central shaft, with landings and platforms jutting into the middle at odd angles. The air hung thick with dust, making depth difficult to judge.
"He's here somewhere, so keep your eyes peeled,"
Luigi instructed, as if Bao hadn't been doing exactly that since the start. He was nervous, she observed, and that meant he was likely speaking to keep himself distracted. This was a terrible idea, of course, since they were supposed to be in stealth mode. With shaking hands, he reached over to snatch a poking iron out of a nearby fireplace, perhaps to use as a weapon if things turned ugly.
"I'm sure he already knows we're here,"
Bao answered, pausing to inspect a wall of glass display cases. Kamek had amassed a vast collection of mystical trinkets, many of which the Boo didn't recognize. A scepter painted with expressive eyes, a 7-pointed compass, and even a very peculiar star-shaped bean. Meanwhile, Luigi was peering down from their ledge, far into the library's depths, searching for the swish of a cloak amidst the impossible spiral of shelves. In the end, it was indeed Kamek who found them first. The little wizard came zipping past on his broom, frantically pulling books from the shelves and tossing them into a travel trunk that hovered along behind him.
"Hey, wait for us!"
Luigi called out, scurrying down the aisle in pursuit of the mage.
"What's the big hurry? We really need your help."
Kamek cast a stray glance behind himself, but didn't bother to slow his pace.
"You said it yourself, this timeline is doomed," he cackled,
leafing through a spell book before flinging it idly aside.
"Only fools stay aboard a sinking ship. I'm skipping over to the nearest stable dimension, where I plan to enjoy a nice, easy retirement."
He kept muttering as he worked, ignoring the heroes that were hot on his heels.
I hear Subcon is lovely this time of year."
With that, the Magic Koopa drew his wand and fired a barrier blast, keeping his pursuers at bay while he rummaged through a glass box filled with gems.
"How rude! We're only here to speak with you,"
Bao cried, throwing herself at the shield but failing to phase through.
"I demand that you let us pass, so we can sit down and talk this over like civilized adults."
The little mage shook his head, chuckling darkly beneath his breath.
"Ah, but you've already tried that, and it didn't work,"
he reminded, referring to their little discussion out on the balcony. He gave the heroes his full attention at last, spinning to face them with an accusing claw outstretched.
"I may be old, but I'm not yet blind. You two have already decided to destroy me, haven't you? If not, then why would you be wielding that iron spike?"
Luigi looked at the tool in his hand, which he had unknowingly been brandishing at Kamek like a sword.
"If you won't help us, then we have no choice,"
he warned, pushing against the barrier in a show of mild bravery.
"Unless you have the pure hearts stashed somewhere in this treasure hoard, then killing you is the only way to save these two worlds."
There was a pleading note to his voice, as if he were trying to give the villain one very last chance. Needless to say, it didn't take.
"You sure know a great deal about my magic, for a man who's dressed for sewer maintenance,"
the wizard sneered, letting the barrier fall and laughing when Luigi tripped through the empty space.
"You don't intimidate me, though. Every time I see your face, I just imagine the version of you that died helpless and screaming."
He said it with a demented little smirk, as if the memory of that night brought him glee.
"You don't feel guilty about any of it, do you?"
Bao asked, deciding that she had never felt more disgusted than she did right now. Not even her own father would sink to this cloaked cretin's level of depravity.
"Do you think that what you did makes you a savior? Because nobody else does."
The mage's eyes narrowed, and Bao knew that she had struck a nerve. She hovered forward steadily, making sure that Kamek heard every word.
"Or perhaps, deep down, you know exactly how much of a failure you are. Maybe you've let everyone suffer for so long, because intervening would mean admitting the truth.
She flew right up into his face, filling his vision as she delivered the coup de grace.
Perhaps you just can't accept that this world would have been better off without you.
The mage's facade broke so quickly that Bao could have sworn she saw it shatter behind his beady little eyes. Or maybe that was his fragile sanity, because his expression was twisting into something truly psychotic.
"Sue, silence, you sassy little fart puff!"
he rasped, swatting the boo away with a frenzied swish of his wand.
"What right do you have to speak of things you never saw? This kingdom still stands because of me. The Shroobs are gone because I destroyed them. Then again, you did end up becoming their leader's pawn,"
Luigi put in, having evidently given up on peaceful negotiations.
"You spent 2 decades helping her get revenge on the planet you thought you had saved."
Kamek rounded on him, twitching in sudden fury, but for once, Luigi didn't back away.
"I can be a screw-up sometimes, but what you did? It's pathetic."
The Magikoopa didn't wait to be insulted further.
"You will both be silent,"
he screeched, lifting his wand to fire a blast of magic down the aisle. While the heroes scurried aside, Kamek warped upwards and spread his arms wide, the entire mystic library trembling at his whim.
"I've spent years suffering for my mistakes, and I didn't survive it all just to be lectured by the likes of you."
There was a tense pause that lingered for just a moment too long, and then, very far away, the echo of a heavy wooden thud. The noise soon repeated, again and again, and Bao floated to the edge of the platform to see what was happening below. At first, she didn't see anything out of the ordinary, until a distant bookshelf flipped back upon itself, slamming into its neighbor as they both sunk away into the wall. Across the hall, 2 more shelves snapped shut like a book, and on the next level up, a whole aisle coiled itself up in flipping segments before sinking into the floor. It was happening everywhere. The library was collapsing, an entire tower of moving parts, all folding themselves up like clockwork origami. The ghost pulled away from the chasm, turning to Kamek with a mix of suspicion and shock.
"What's happening down there? What is the meaning of this?"
The wizard merely shrugged, pulling his demeanor back together.
"I already told you, I'm packing my things,"
he answered, upending his floating trunk and spilling its contents into the pit.
"I'd only planned to bring a few essentials, but now I think I'll take it all."
He clicked his tongue and began to fly away, casually tossing back one final warning.
"As for the 2 of you, I'm afraid you'll likely be crushed. Try not to smear yourselves on anything valuable, okay?"
And with that, he was gone again. Luigi briefly tried to give chase, but thought better of it when he saw beyond the railing.
"Let's get to the entrance,"
he urged, pointing back the way they had come. But even as he said it, the distant sliver of light was swallowed up by layers of shifting, folding shelves.
"On second thought, keep climbing. There has to be another exit somewhere up there."
He took off running, with Lady Bao floating along at his heels. She had been doing an awful lot of fleeing lately, which wasn't typically her style, but she supposed it came with the territory of being Luigi's partner. Several times, she spied Kamek in the distance, watching silently as they scrambled to climb the tower.
"He's not even trying to get away, is he? That freak just wants to spectate our demise."
As they ran, patches of the floor began to splinter and separate, morphing into sets of gnashing wooden jaws. Luigi leapt between them, wall-jumping off shelves to keep himself out of the grinder. Meanwhile, Bao avoided the hazards by merely floating above their reach.
"Ooh, possessed furniture? How utterly basic!"
she scoffed, but this was no mere haunted house display, and the wizard had barely begun to pull tricks from his sleeve. Suddenly, books began cascading off the shelves, coming to life mid-fall and fluttering into the air like dusty, leather-bound bats. The spell's effect pulsed outward, rippling up the shaft, until the vast chamber began to fill with a restless cloud of tomes. Bao tried to ignore it all by phasing, but soon the flock became too thick to see through, and she was forced to retreat to a lower altitude. Luigi was swinging at the bats with his iron, trying to clear a path through the swarm. He managed to swat one away, causing Kamek to yell out in objection from the sidelines.
"Gah, watch where you're flailing! That was a first edition."
When Bao looked back, Luigi's weapon had been transformed into a red plastic hammer, which squeaked harmlessly as he tossed it away. He gave her a desperate shrug as they kept on running. Together, they made their way up the winding tower, following the pathway around outcroppings and across bridges. Several times, Bao had to turn Luigi intangible to avoid the flipping shelves, which threatened to smack him into the abyss. The library was continuing to devour itself, packing its pieces ever tighter, and the Boo found herself wondering how long it would be until the spell left them trapped. As it turned out, the answer lay just around the next bend. Up ahead, the walkway itself was peeling backward, each slatted floorboard slipping away beneath the next. The nearby bridges were retracting as well, giving the heroes nowhere to go except a narrow passage to the left, which was still spewing out enchanted books. After a moment of fidgety indecision, Luigi hunched his shoulders and plowed ahead into the gloom. Bao followed after him, intangible but blind. She couldn't see a thing through the flapping pages, so she relied on her partner's yelps and gasps to keep track of the path. For once, she found herself envying Vivian's ability to slip underground and bypass situations like this.
"But poor Luigi has it even worse than I do," she supposed, "and I can't hide him while he's moving. What we need is a way to clear the air. But how does one scare away a creature made of paper?"
The answer hit her like a warm breeze, and she reached up to grab hold of her hairbow. Sure enough, the fire flower was still tucked in there, exactly as she had left it earlier that night. She pulled it free, and was about to offer it to Luigi, but the sounds of his struggle made her hesitate. At the rate he was being smacked around, the flower would be wasted on him. Its effects only lasted until the user was struck by something, after all. Bao knew what needed to happen, but she was in no way eager for it. If she ate the plant, then she'd be able to keep its power by phasing through the books, but weren't fire flowers supposed to taste spicy and awful? She didn't want any part of that. As a high-class lady, her palate was very sensitive.
"Ugh, enough whining. This is no time for me to be acting like a royal brat,"
she thought, crumpling up the flower and shoving it into her mouth. She felt the effects before the petals even touched her tongue. It was like a torch had been lit at the back of her throat, briefly blinding her as the inferno spread outward. When the pain subsided, Beau's first instinct was to see what about herself had changed. She spied a mirror, nestled in a nearby reading nook, and saw that her whole body had turned a very pale orange. Even her hair bows looked fiery, with a spikier shape and embers dancing at the ribbon tips. Next, she raised her arm and tried to summon a fireball, but that isn't quite what happened. Instead of flames appearing in her hand, her entire self ignited like a spectral flare.
"Ah, what? Did I eat it the wrong way?"
She panicked, whirling around to get a glimpse of herself, but only ending up with a face full of trailing fire. She hadn't expected this, but then again, she had never eaten a fire flower before. Perhaps this was simply how the plants affected Boo's. In any case, she had become a living, unliving, fireball, and the paper bats were screeching in fear as they tried to get away. They flew backwards as Bao surged ahead, piling back onto the shelves in an effort to hide themselves amongst the normal books that remained there. As the hallway cleared, Luigi was able to pick up the pace, and soon the two heroes were charging ahead, kept safe by an aura of ghostly light. But things were never that simple, were they? Just as their luck began to turn, Luigi gave a pained shout, and Bao spun back to see him caught in one of the floorboard's gnashing jaws. He had been snared by the ankle, and now he was trying to pry himself free before the splintery teeth could pull him in deeper.
"Yeah, you don't wanna eat me,"
he stammered, kicking at the floor with his free leg.
"Just look at me. You would find more meat on a dry bones."
The issue resolved itself before Bao had to get involved, but the way it happened hardly made things easier. The shelves gave a shuddering groan, and then the entire passage spun sideways, rolling over itself as the grand library continued to shift. The floor became a wall, and Luigi fell to safety with a yelp and the sound of tearing pants. He leapt to his feet, stumbling as the hallway settled with a dull crash, and set off sprinting yet again. Bao flew on ahead, dipping and diving into the shelves whenever she saw the books beginning to stir. The flames trailed behind her, engulfing the helpless tomes as she swept intangibly through them. The passage would become a burning ruin, but that was fine, as long as the way ahead stayed clear. That was her plan, at least, until the corridor began to rotate upwards. She first noticed when the books began to slide backwards, as if gravity itself had suddenly shifted sideways. Luigi cried out, and the Boo turned back to see him fighting his way uphill, staggering forward, and then clawing up the shelves with his hands as the slope became steeper. All around them, the wooden walls were creaking in agony, and the darkness seemed to deepen as the entire tunnel pitched up into a vertical shaft.
"What happens now?"
Luigi asked, pausing for breath as he hung onto the wall for dear life. Somewhere up above, a single spell book fell from its shelf, catching fire as it plummeted through Bo's body. Luigi flinched as it fell past, but then the pair of them simply stared, watching as the tome illuminated the sheer depth of the pit that yawned away beneath them.
"Please don't say that we have to go all the way back down there."
Bao didn't fancy the idea either, so instead she turned her gaze skyward. Straining her eyes against the gloom, she could just make out a ray of pale light, spilling into the shaft through some far-distant window. It must be even open, because many of the books were vanishing through it, fluttering away into the freedom of the night.
"Look up there! I think I can see a way out."
Luigi blinked the sweat from his eyes, then began to wall kick up the shaft, taking the time to line up each jump, even as the shelves started peeling away. The library was tearing itself down around them, and when Bao glanced back, she instantly regretted it. The collapse had reached her hastily lit fires, and now the blaze was surfing up on splintered wood. Endless rows of torch teeth in a black and hungry maw.
"Luigi dear, I don't mean to rush you, but this is the time to be speedy, not graceful,"
she cried out, trying her best to light the way above him. He picked up the pace, just enough, and soon the little window was in sight. Bao could even see the railing of a balcony, and the golden sky beyond. But just as she began to feel hopeful, the tricky tower snatched it all away again. A row of shelves slammed shut across the passage, denying the exit and leaving the heroes stranded with the flames. They pulled up short, just in time to avoid slamming headfirst into the barrier. Luigi braced himself in one corner, and spent a few seconds pounding futilely against the wood. He yelled for help, although no one could save them, but his pleas became coughs as the air filled with smoke. From where Bao floated beside him, she thought she could hear the echo of cackling from just beyond the wall. For a fleeting second, she was struck with the thought of how easy it would be to escape by herself. She just needed to face through this barricade, but no, that was a vile idea. Luigi was her friend, more or less, and she would never leave him to die like this. They could both survive this, if only she could think of a plan. But there was nothing. No sudden epiphanies, only the gnashing of 10,000 burning fangs.
"Come on, Bao, just do something.
Her body was boiling, she felt like screaming. The fire filled her vision, her mind, and soul, and then the entire world went white. Outside the mage's tower, where space bent normally, a burnt wooden box sat at the back of an alcove. Not a sound could be heard, save the mournful whistling of the wind. Until suddenly, the box erupted in a pulse of fiery sawdust. The compressed library blew apart like a crate of fireworks, and a heavily soot-stained Luigi was sent skidding across the balcony. He landed against the railing with an oomph. Flat on his back with his legs splayed in the air. He never wanted to move again, but sadly, he knew that he had precious little choice. He pulled himself up, a bit shakily, and studied the new surroundings. The balcony framed one end of a precarious stone bridge, which arced across the expanse between this spire and its sibling. Luigi refused to look down, so instead he focused on the sky, still eerily bright with star fallout. He could see a few more towers, shadows in the distance, but so much of the skyline had fallen since he had seen it last. He didn't want to dwell on it, so he sat down next to Lady Bao, who was lingering tiredly just beside the alcove. For someone who didn't need to breathe, she was looking miserably out of breath, and perhaps even paler than usual.
"Hey, are you feeling all right?"
Luigi asked, surprised by the level of concern in his own voice.
"I've never seen anyone overclock a power-up like that. It can't be healthy."
The ghost had saved them both, at the last second, by expending her flower power at once. She had blown a hole through the wall that would make any Bob-omb proud, but it had clearly sapped a lot of her strength.
"I'm fine,"
she insisted,
"but I'll be useless without a short rest."
She gave Luigi's leg a pat, then huffed in defeat when nothing happened.
"See? I can't even turn you intangible. Can you try to keep yourself safe for a while?"
A troubled silence settled in, until Luigi heard the swish of fabric and the scuttling of claws on marble. He turned back to find Kamek perched on the bridge, staring warily at the heroes with his wand half raised. The three of them simply stared for a long and awkward moment, as if none of them were eager to learn what happened next. Nobody expected Luigi to strike first, not even himself, but before he knew what was happening, his legs were leading him into battle. As he sprinted up the bridge, the wizard yelped and warped back, flailing his wand to fire a single bolt of magic between them. The ground quaked as the spell rippled through it, but Luigi didn't stop running until a massive grey fist exploded up from the stone. With a roar that spilled like an avalanche of gravel, a huge womp clawed its way up and free from the bridge. The living slab stood across the path, with cracks through its eyes that made them look bloodshot and deranged. Luigi skidded to a halt just inches away, glancing up nervously as it loomed overhead.
"My, what thick masonry you have!"
he stammered as it tipped forward with a snarl. He could imagine it saying,
"All the better to crush you with,"
but in truth, it merely grumbled and began to fall. Luigi scrambled back, tripping over his heels, but managed to get away just in time. The monster face planted with a mighty crash, causing a web of tiny fissures to split open along its backside. Seeing his chance, Luigi sprung upwards, ready to slam down and smash the beast to pieces. But alas, the womp was quick to push itself upright, and Luigi slid harmlessly down the slope of its back. As he landed, he shot a glare towards Kamek, who was spectating the scene with a cheeky grin. Behind them, the stone creature was struggling to rotate. The pathway was too narrow for its bulk, so it was teetering on one foot as it clumsily tried to spin with the other. Inspiration struck, and Luigi threw himself against the slab, elbowing it with all his might. The beast staggered as he tackled it, losing its balance and tipping sideways against the guardrail. With a gravelly wail, it broke through and plummeted off the bridge. Luigi nearly went with it, but managed to catch himself at the edge. Gazing down, he got an eyeful of vertigo, but kept his eyes on the whomp as it fell. He saw it smash against the tower, cracking apart into harmless rubble before dispersing into the rifts. As he stumbled back up, a deafening roar boomed between the spires. Luigi braced himself for Kamek's next summon, but the mage's startled gasp meant that he wasn't to blame. A tremor rocked the bridge, then another, a rhythmic pounding that violently set the pace of Luigi's heartbeat. He stepped back while Kamek leaned forward, but neither was prepared for what happened next. From out of the mist, two titans exploded into view like comets, locked in battle amidst a storm of scales and starlight. King Bowser swiped at the Empress, laying punches into her while she tried in vain to bind his arms with her tendrils. They thrashed across the horizon together, snapping and snarling, until Bowser pulled into his shell. The giant Koopa surged forward, dragging the shroob until he crashed into a tower, then spinning to pin her against it as the walls came down around them. While Luigi steadied himself through the shockwave, Kamek stood rigid and nearly catatonic. He was mumbling to himself, his wand twitching between targets, as if the old mage was trying to choose which of his hated masters he'd rather shoot first.
"You slimy tyrant,"
he hissed, firing a wave of blasts at the Empress.
"You deceived me, used me, held me back, but you haven't beaten me. I've been your thrall for long enough."
The alien slipped free of Bowser's grip, and Kamek howled in frustration as the barrage missed by miles. He conjured his broom with a flourish, preparing to give chase.
"If he gets away, then it's all over."
Thinking quickly, Luigi grabbed the broom by its bristles and yanked it away. The hero tried to snap it over his knee, but that hurt a lot, so he cracked it against the railing instead, sending splinters and straw into the void below. Bao cheered from the sidelines, but Luigi barely heard her as Kamek turned on him.
"What have you done, you hairy-lipped halfwit?"
The wizard spat, clawing at the air as he fired another spell. The hero ducked beneath it, heard it strike the stone behind him, but the enemy was just getting started.
"You and your friends have ruined everything. My books, my leg, and now my escape? What more can you take from me?"
Luigi edged backward, hoping to return to the balcony where he could move more freely. But Bao screamed a warning, and he turned back in time to see a segment of the bridge capsize. The one behind it flipped up like a hatch, and suddenly the whole structure was in chaos.
"That spell I dodged is making it all flip out,"
he realized, jumping straight up as the marble barrel rolled beneath him. In the background, Bowser and the Empress were thundering off elsewhere. Kamek watched them go, forsaken, but then he began to laugh, and that's when Luigi realized what he was in for. The Magic Koopa was livid and unhinged, but worst of all, he was stuck here. He summoned a line of illusory clones, who all shared the same grimace of pure hate. When they spoke, it was with one voice.
"If you want to fight me so badly, then let's begin. You've earned my undivided attention." "Oh stars, I wish my bro was here,"
he thought, trapped between a foe and a fall. But no, this was his task, his fight, and everyone was counting on him.
"I can do this,"
he told himself, standing bravely as the wizard raised his wand, maniacally, and magic lit the air. As one fierce battle began, another was gearing towards its climax. Bowser punched the Empress through the hull of a fallen cruiser, and decided that he was having the time of his life. She tore her way free before the dust had settled, prying bits of the ship into scrap metal daggers. Bowser lunged at her as she flailed up to meet him, keeping her weapons at bay with some well-timed sideswipes. A few hyphae eluded him, but their knives bent uselessly against the plates of his shell. The Koopa bashed her head against the hull, laughing, until a low sweeping tendril snared his ankle and tripped him onto his back. The Empress washed over him like a wave, threading her hyphae beneath his shell and squeezing like she meant to crack him open. Her scrap daggers tore at his scales, and her throat began to glow with the light of a plasma sphere. Instinctively, Bowser withdrew and began to spin like a top, faster and faster, until he was sure his spikes must be drilled clean through the ground below. As he hit max speed, he felt the alien's grip began to weaken. He threw out his claws, stopping himself suddenly as she was flung into the distance with an almost comically high-pitched wail.
"Don't ride the Koopa carousel if you can't hang on,"
he thought, taking a moment to catch his breath. This battle was a total stalemate, but that was the point. After all, he just needed to keep wailing on her until her invincibility ran out.
"How long is that gonna take, huh?"
He frowned, stomping off across the wasteland.
"This whole battlefield is going down fast."
Had he not seen it, he never would have believed that this had been a city mere hours ago. Sure, there were towers here and there, along with wreckage, but for the most part, the portals made this place look like some kind of swirling eldritch swamp. The Empress surged from the mist, fangs bared in fury and tendrils lashing like whips. Bowser prepared to grapple with her again, but she tried something new this time. The beast stretched to her full height, balancing on a tripod of tentacles. The rest flared out randomly, igniting into a psychedelic web of sweeping lasers. They shredded the landscape, but Bowser wasn't impressed.
"She looks ridiculous, like a disco light show mixed with one of those flailing sprinkler things."
He marched forward, letting the beam sizzle against his star-charged scales, until he was close enough to grab one of the hyphae as it swept by. He laughed when her eyes went wide, plainly shocked that her ultimate attack had been thwarted so easily. That's when he gave a sharp tug, guffawing even harder as the beast came toppling down. But Bowser had something better planned than letting her face plant. He caught a few of her thrashing limbs, then swung the Empress sideways in an arc, being sure to let her bash against some rocks along the way. She struck the wall of a tower, but without enough force to crack it through. Instead, her free tendrils kept flying, whipping around the spire, and Bowser caught them as they came around the other side. With a tangle of limbs in each hand, the Koopa began to pull as hard as he could. The Empress, fearing he meant to tear them off, tried to get away by writhing upwards, wriggling up the tower like a worm. Bowser kept pulling, stretching the hyphae to their limit, until he felt the stone begin to break. And then he simply let go, slingshotting the screaming creature into the sky. But the combo wasn't gonna end there. Bowser pursued his enemy with a stupendous star-charged leap, intercepted her in midair, then pinned her beneath him as he shifted his weight into a ground pound. Claws and tentacles locked together, the two monsters fell like a meteor towards the most epic pile driver in history. They hit the ground with a pulsing blast of energy, enough to vaporize the surrounding debris. A full minute later, Bowser pulled himself up from the pit they had made, then turned back to stare at the Empress. She lay in a crumpled heap, unmoving, and her golden glow was finally starting to fade away, revealing the bruised purple skin beneath. He knew exactly what this meant. It was time for the finishing blow. He stood at the edge of the crater, preparing to use a skill he had been saving for just this moment. Rays of starlight glinted through his fangs as he inhaled, and an instant later, his mouth tore wide into the brightest cosmic beam to be seen all night. He inwardly grinned as the Empress vanished from sight.
"This is for my troops, you nasty old space squid."
But somehow, she withstood the laser, and even seemed to be breathing more steadily as the light faded.
"Huh, I guess I fired too early,"
Bowser muttered, adjusting his stance for a second shot. But just as he exhaled, the Empress lurched into his face, wrapping herself around him as the beam fired straight into her open mouth. Shocked, Bowser tried to end the attack, but his own powers refused to listen. He could feel her tendrils reaching into his mouth, prying his jaws open to increase the flow of energy. She inhaled it all, and soon began to shimmer once more.
"She's sucking the starlight right out of me,"
he realized with disgust, which turned to sharp panic as his body began to shrink.
"Gah, that means she's turning me puny again."
The Empress wounds were healing, but that wasn't the only metamorphosis taking place. A pair of gargantuan spines had sprouted from her back, and grew longer and sharper as the siphoning progressed. Bowser wasn't sure what they were meant to be, until they began to unfurl, twisting apart into vast webs of wispy mycelium, each strand bound together by a film of golden light. To the Koopa's horror, the repowered shroom had grown a set of ethereal, wasp-like wings. She launched herself skyward with a single flap, soaring high into the night while clutching Bowser in one limb like a ragdoll.
"You failed again, lizard,"
she roared, her inferno eyes now fully reignited.
"I enjoyed myself, but I think it's time we parted ways."
She threw him aside, as easily and carelessly as one might flick away a gnat. Bowser fell blindly, unable to flip himself, until he smashed against the remains of a spire. As he plunged down the side, great chunks of rubble fell with him. He landed with a grunt, too weak to move before the rocks fell and flattened him to paste. But that never happened. The next thing Bowser knew, he had slipped through the ground into some kind of nowhere. He looked up to see the tower collapse through a fog, as if he were watching it happen on an old film projector.
"What the heck is this?"
he shouted, then glanced down to find Vivian clinging to his arm.
"Aha, I knew you were a ghost. I just died, and now you're here to drag me away to the underwear."
She blew some hair out of her eyes, looking more exasperated than he had seen her before.
"For the last time, I'm not a—"
she started, but quickly lost her nerve, peering off into the darkness.
Never mind. Anyway, these are the shadows. I pulled you down here to save you."
She began lifting Bowser back to the surface, straining visibly from the effort.
But you're pretty heavy, so it might be a one-time thing."
When they had returned to solid ground, Bowser grumbled a few syllables that Vivian could either take or leave as a thank you. They had emerged in the middle of a secluded street, somewhere where the pavement was still intact enough to support them. Mario was waiting for them over by the curb, pacing in circles while a million useless plans collided in his mind. Helpless, the three of them could only watch as their starlit enemy thundered her way across the sky.
"How is that fair?"
Bowser whined, cursing the monster that had snatched a victory from his literal jaws.
"When I stole that power, all I did was get bigger. How come she gets to fly?"
The Empress soon disappeared behind the ruins, but her heading was clear. She was making a beeline for the massive maelstrom. Mario ran forward a few steps, but then realized that giving chase was a hopeless endeavor.
"I don't think we can catch up by ourselves,"
he said, with an edge of desperation to his voice.
"If only we had some way to freeze her in place."
Just then, the hero tripped back with a yelp as a fissure opened in the sidewalk beneath him. This had been a safe place just moments ago, but the rifts were already starting to encroach on the street corner from all sides. Vivian rushed over to grab his wrist, but as she pulled him to safety, a tiny scrap of paper fluttered from his pocket and into the gripping breeze. Reflexively, he caught it between his fingers before it slipped away. He fell utterly silent as he brought it closer for inspection, staring at it with an odd mixture of displeasure and awe. Vivian looked over his shoulder, uncomprehending, and even though Bowser couldn't quite see the scrap from where he stood, he could tell that it was coated in a great deal of glitter.
Oh, no!
Bowser inwardly groaned, stomping closer to get his first good look at the little thing.
Please tell me that's not what I think it is.
Yoshi looked back often during the hike to safety. Each time, he thought that the view of the palace couldn't possibly get weirder, and each time, he was proven wrong. The dinosaur stood at the top of a grassy hill, waiting for Goombella and the toads to catch up. Their escape pod had crashed in the Piedmont beyond the river, and after a heated debate, the group had decided to get as far from danger as possible. But when Giant Bowser had appeared behind them, the unanimous choice had been to sit back, watch the fight, and wish for popcorn. Toad was still chattering about it, mostly to the tune of how cool it would have been to fight in Bowser's stead.
"I'd give that squid the ol' 1-2 truffle shuffle,"
he said, hopping up the hillside as he traded punches with a phantom foe.
"And then I'd throw in a few headbutts, because style points are important."
Goombella was rambling too, theorizing aloud about what the other creature could have been. Only Toadette, who had fallen a few steps behind, seemed to realize the severity of the situation. Yoshi wandered down to offer her a ride, and she wearily but gratefully climbed aboard. When the girl finally spoke, she didn't look up, as if she were searching the grass for shreds of hope.
"When things look bleakest, that's when Mario always saves the day, right?"
Yoshi wanted to comfort her, but had things ever been quite this bleak before? He kept quiet, but the silence was soon filled with the echo of an avalanche. Behind them, a massive section of the palace's wall had fallen, and with it came all the wiring and machinery that had been strung along the top. The tangled silver snake was pulled into the void, shrieking like a particularly panicked train wreck, and that was all the answer anyone needed. But then, before stillness could settle back in, a shadow passed underfoot, flickering across the hillside to the sound of a haunting scream. An icy wind rippled after it, and Toadette shivered in the saddle, but by then the shape was already gone. Yoshi peered into the wasteland, and briefly saw a wisp of darkness beneath the dust, streaking toward the palace like a subterranean shooting star. Goombella ran downhill to join them, looking more than a bit spooked.
"Whoa, what the heck was that?"
she asked, but Yoshi had no answer to give. Whatever the shadow had been, the dinosaur had a very bad feeling about it. He hoped that Mario was safe, and that he was ready, because whatever happened next was going to change everything. Mario couldn't quite describe how he felt right now, as he stared at the little thing between his fingers. His two companions were huddled around him, the madness of their surroundings temporarily forgotten. In his hand, the hero held a crumpled and half-peeled sticker. To be specific, it was a thing sticker bearing the image of a fridge. Mario had seen it not too long ago, when he and Vivian had visited the lovely House of Badges, but he hadn't thought much of it at the time. Bowser let out a low growl, his nostrils flaring as he examined the shiny thing.
"What is that doing here? It should have been burned with all the rest."
It was an unpleasant memory. When the sticker comet had passed over the Mushroom Kingdom, everyone had gone a little bit crazy. According to the royal scientists, the comet's glittery dust had actually been an extremely potent hallucinogen. Mario himself had spent the duration of his quest believing that the entire world was made of paper and art supplies. Bowser had suffered even worse, so deep in his delusions that he had even forgotten how to speak. When the adventure was said and done, they'd all agreed to never speak of it again. But Mario had never been very good at cleaning out his pockets, and so apparently this one little sticker had survived.
"A way to freeze the Empress,"
he whispered, looking from his hand to the sky and back again. If this was meant to be a miracle, then it was a rather flimsy one, and yet...
"Wait, is this little sticker magical?"
Vivian asked, catching on quickly. Mario nodded, and briefly explained how the enchanted paper scraps worked. As she listened, the siren's eyes began to light up with newfound hope.
Ice magic is exactly what we needed,
she said when the tutorial was finished.
If we use this, then the Empress and everything around her will be frozen solid, right?
But just when a path to victory seemed possible, Bowser interjected with a bit of grim logic.
Not so fast, you heroic types always run into battle with your plans half-baked.
He gestured around at the barren streets, and then pointed off in the direction that the enemy had flown.
Mario, you and I both know that we can't just stick that thing anywhere. It has to be used at extremely close range.
That was certainly true, but it was an issue that Mario had already thought of.
I'm not quick enough to catch up with the Empress on foot,
he admitted, before turning to Vivian with an idea to share.
But you can, by swimming through the shadows. If we leave right now, then the two of us might be able to reach her before she hits the point of no return.
Unfortunately, there must have been a flaw in the scheme, because Vivian shook her head and backed away.
I can't help with this,
she said, looking far more ashamed than she had any right to be.
The shadows are splitting apart, just like the surface. I'm not sure if I could navigate them fast enough, and we might get trapped if the piece of ground we're inside breaks loose.
Oh, well, that certainly shut things down. Without a way to reach the Empress, then maybe the fridge sticker was truly useless after all.
This was a waste of time,
Mario thought, preparing to stuff the scrap of paper back into his pocket.
What kind of final battle hinges on having a specific type of item, anyway?
Bowser, for his part, had fallen unusually silent. He stared down the boulevard for a long while, before picking up a small stone and tossing it into a nearby rift. It floated amidst the magic for a second or two, before crumbling into dust as the pull took hold. The king watched it happen with a sigh, but then turned back to the group with clenched fists and determined eyes.
I know exactly how we're gonna get there.
When neither Mario nor Vivian replied, Bowser took it as a cue to elaborate.
I've seen you surfing on Koopa shells before. As insulting as that is, I have to admit that it's a pretty clever trick.
He broke into a defiant grin, and pounded the front of his shell with pride.
This thing is tougher than steel. We'll have at least a few minutes before that dark magic sinks its teeth into me.
To be honest, Mario still wasn't sure if he understood the flow of Bowser's gambit, especially when Step 1 seemed so totally insane.
You want me to ride on your shell?
He asked, but the Koopa only returned an impatient nod. The hero thought back to earlier, when he had tried the same thing with a common Troopa. It hadn't worked out so well that time, but
I guess it's really the only option that we've got left.
To his surprise, Bowser knelt down on the spot and began to withdraw.
Let's get on with it, then,
he grumbled, but as Mario stepped closer, he saw a pair of red eyes glaring at him from the shell's dark interior.
But if you get scuff marks on me with your grimy plumber boots, then I'm roasting you alive. No more Mr. Nice Nemesis, got it?
Mario turned to speak with Vivian, but she had already slipped past him, and was busy climbing onto the Koopa's back.
Well, we just need to get close enough to use the sticker,
she reminded herself, a bit flustered as she awkwardly tried to situate herself between the spikes.
I've never done this before. Which way am I supposed to be facing?
Reluctantly, Mario let her down and back to the sidewalk. As much as he hated it, this was a mission meant for him alone. Plus Bowser.
You need to stay here,
he told her, each word stinging like a bristle's thorns.
If something goes wrong, then you wouldn't be able to jump to safety.
This was about more than just her survival, though.
Besides, what about our friends? If I don't come back, then it'll be up to you to find and protect them.
He expected her to protest, or to yell at him for doing something so suicidally foolish by himself, and perhaps she wanted to, but she held herself together. After all, she wouldn't be Vivian if she didn't have the utmost faith in him.
"Be as careful as you can, Mario,"
she said, taking one of his hands between her own.
"I love you, but you already knew that, didn't you?"
And then, just like that, their lives changed again.
"I love you too, Viv."
He hadn't meant to say it, but he didn't second-guess the words once they'd come spilling out. It was true, of course. After tonight, Mario was sure of at least that much. The siren gasped and glided closer, her eyes filled with wonder, but also with understanding that this moment couldn't last.
"I wish we had more time,"
she whispered as they pulled each other into an embrace. After a few seconds, Mario felt something being placed snugly onto his head, and realized that Vivian had chosen this moment to return his hat. She pulled away, with tears in her eyes, and gave him her bravest and brightest smile.
"There, you should look your best for such an exciting finale."
They parted ways, and the surrounding chaos seemed to surge back in around them. Vivian, now bare of accessories, retreated meekly to the sidelines while Mario approached the shell. He pushed it like a bobsled, with each hand gripping a spike, until it had built up enough speed for him to leap aboard. As it hurtled off down the avenue, one fact was painfully clear: the final level had begun. And final levels were rarely beaten without losing a life or two in the process. The ruins and space junk passed by in blurring shades of white and silver. At this speed, the only constant presence was the sky, but its golden swirls were far too strange to be a calming sight. The hero focused on the path ahead, littered with hazards, and on the ultimate challenge he'd face at the end. The magic sticker seemed to tingle in his hand, just waiting for the chance to unleash its power. The difficulty increased when it came time to veer around an obstacle. To put it bluntly, Bowser was heavy, and that made it much harder for Mario to make split-second turns. After a few near crashes, he learned to lean into each swerve with all his weight. That made steering easier, but it was a tiring process.
"I'd tell Bowser to go on a diet, but I doubt he knows what that is."
Straight onwards, splashing through smaller portals as if they were puddles. Across a crumbling intersection, then around a landslide of rubble, followed by a dizzying ricochet off the hull of a fallen saucer. Bowser snarled at the last one, a deep and savage rumbling from within the shell.
"Sorry, but this was your idea,"
Mario said, fighting to keep his balance,
"and the ride is only going to get bumpier from here."
It was true, too. As the land grew more desolate, the safer routes became harder to find. Eventually, the Empress came into view, but strangely, she seemed to be hovering in place, her tendrils limp beneath her like a mass of hanging vines. Warily, the hero turned in her direction, veering through a tunnel made from the bent wing of a starship. He emerged from the other side at breakneck speed, rounded one final bend. And there it was. Brewing ahead of him was the massive maelstrom itself, an insatiable sea of dark magic the size of 9 city blocks. Lightning arced across the expanse, but no thunder could be heard above the void's own deafening drone. Even from here, Mario could feel the greedy winds tearing at his sides, eager to snatch him up as a sacrificial morsel for the storm. The Empress dominated the skies above, wings beating furiously as she made her descent towards the portal. As Mario sped down the straightaway, he glanced desperately around for a bit of stone or wreckage, but all of that had long since been swept away.
"There's really no choice,"
he realized, although deep down he had known for a while.
"The only place to put the sticker is on the Empress herself."
He banked hard to the left, surfing down the empty remains of a side street. For just a minute, he was able to skirt the event horizon while trying to brainstorm, but this time, there were no clever last-second ideas.
One way forward and no way back, just like the good old days.
He took a last breath to steady his nerves, ignored Bowser's threats of protest, and swerved inwards. Together, the age-old rivals flew off the precipice and into the whirling tempest. It pulled them along amidst streaks of violet black, and white cracks skittered through the current as reality itself began to split. The gale was so fierce that Mario had to hunker down and cling to the shell spikes, but this still wasn't where they needed to be, so he leaned sideways and urged them further in, towards the even deadlier central rush. They weaved their way across the wormhole, veering beneath a slab of marble that jutted up diagonally from the haze. The sight of it made Mario wonder what was happening in this very spot back home. The skyscrapers of Mushroom City stood just a world away. How many lives had the maelstrom claimed over there, or had the botched spell even managed to break through yet? But this was no time for such fears. They were passing beneath the Empress, and Mario could see the tips of her hyphae threading down around him. He gazed up at her bulbous underbelly, wondering if he might be able to reach it if he jumped.
No, she's still too high,
he decided, steering Bowser up and out of the alien's shadow.
If I missed, then I'd just fall back into the void, and this would have all been for nothing.
They'd have to sweep around for another pass, but time was running scarce. The Empress would submerge soon, and the wormhole's pull was growing harder to resist by the second.
Hurry it up already!
The Koopa yelled from down below, his voice shaking with a scarily un-Bowserish note of urgency.
I hate to wimp out on you, but I'm starting to feel like a soft shell stew in here.
Halfway up around the spiral, Mario spotted the leaning pillar that he had passed before. It was too far from the shrub to be a sticker surface, but that's not how inspiration struck. Years of kart racing had trained the hero's eye, and the slab was the perfect angle for a ramp. So perfect that it must be been fate. With a glance at the Empress to confirm trajectory, Mario spun back and adjusted course for the final time. Their arc was wide enough to carry them all the way to the maelstrom's edge, uphill from their stony launch pad. For one breathless moment, time stood still as Mario banked into the air. He gazed out across the chasm, to where the Empress had begun to submerge. He leaned forward, and then the shell was barreling downward through the fog. Its speed doubled, then tripled, and then it was sailing perfectly out onto the ramp, which immediately cracked beneath the extra weight, tipping over and firing the duo pathetically off target. As Mario flailed through the air, he realized that he'd never even make it half the required distance.
If only I had a cape feather,
he thought as the vortex rose hungrily up to claim him,
or a cloud flower, or even good old flood.
His thoughts were smashed by the grip of claws around his torso. Bowser had unfurled from his shell, and seized the hero with a single scaly hand.
You're gonna destroy that thing,
the king ordered, meeting Mario's eyes with a firm intensity that bordered on trust. They fell together for one last instant, until Bowser reeled back his arm for the pitch of a lifetime.
You're gonna ruin her, and show her why you've been my rival all these years.
And then Mario was airborne, hurled into the winds with the strength of a cannon's blast. Far behind him, with a last resounding roar, the mighty Koopa King tumbled headlong into oblivion. But his aim had been true, and the space between Mario and the Empress was closing fast. She had sunken up to her lower jaw, but she still managed a shriek when the hero crash-landed between her eyes.
What the? How did you?
She started, but never finished, because that's when Mario reached out, peeled the sticker, and slammed it straight into her hideous alien forehead. In his mind's eye, Mario envisioned a giant refrigerator bursting open to blow an icy wind across the battlefield. In reality, the air simply began to grow very, very cold. The hero held on for dear life as the monster's flesh began to glaze over with frost. She was bawling, thrashing about, trying to fend off a magical assault that she couldn't even see. But it was all in vain, and when the phantom blizzard passed, Empress Shroob was no more than a glorified iceberg. Frozen hyphae arced overhead, refracting muted rainbows across the silent mass. Mario clung to the side of it, victorious but stranded, with little to do now but wait for the numb and bitter end. Just too far away, a certain shadow had knelt for cover behind a boulder. Vivian knew that she wasn't supposed to be this close to the action, but this was no time to be scared for herself. It hadn't been easy, but the siren had finally managed to navigate her way here, to a cluster of stones beside the vortex. The sidewalk ended a few yards away, at a sheer drop into the screaming winds. Trailing Mario to this place had been against his wishes, but something told Vivian that she needed to tag along. She quickly saw why, once she felt brave enough to peek out from behind the boulder. The crystallized Empress was hard to miss, as was the speck of red shivering against her face.
He isn't dead,
Vivian thought, with relief that immediately fractured into dread.
But how long can he hold on to such an icy surface? He'll fall if he isn't rescued.
She began to fret, desperately trying to think of some way to safely bridge the expanse. No ideas came, and every wasted second made her feel even more useless. How many times, how many hundreds of times, had Mario selflessly leapt to the aid of someone in need? Now, for once, he was the one in need of saving, and Vivian couldn't think of a single way to help him. Half-formed possibilities were rejected as soon as they came.
Could I stretch myself across?
Of course not, her tail would never extend that far.
If I pushed these rocks into the current, could Mario use them as stepping stones?
No, not even he could traverse such a lethal gauntlet.
Oh, this is hopeless. Why am I so uncreative?
Unbeknownst to Vivian, a dark shape was slinking up over the rise of some rubble behind her. It stretched and wavered, breathing raggedly as if it had been swimming non-stop for miles. The figure tracked Vivian with feral eyes, waiting for her to pace beneath its perch. Until finally, with a hiss that sounded too much like a sob, it pounced. The siren heard the battle cry, but by then it was too late. The predator's hands clamped around her neck, and no matter which way she twisted, the thing refused to be shaken off. Thinking quickly, she engulfed her hand in flames and thrust it back over her shoulder. The attacker turned loose, scrambling back out of reach with a familiar squeal. Vivian spun around to meet the eyes of a mirror image. Against all reason, her duplicate had come crawling back to the battlefield. Her body was covered in bruises, no doubt inflicted by the crash of her saucer. Yet in spite of her injuries, and the distance she must be traveled, she looked more vicious than ever.
Yeah, you should have just stayed put out there,
Vivian warned, taking several deep breaths while she still had the chance. The faux siren's eyes almost seemed to sparkle at the challenge.
Your dear Mario can't step between us this time,
she purred, ignoring the wedge of sidewalk that broke off behind her.
I hope he's watching, though, because I'm finally going to kill you.
A few good fireballs could end this, but Vivian was still a step behind. Just as her fists ignited, a pair of shadowy shackles burst from the ground, snaring her wrists before she could dodge. They retracted with a yank, tripping the siren into the path of a third hand which seized her by the throat.
Your old tricks aren't scary anymore,
the enemy said, gliding forward as the three hands squeezed.
It's your fault that you're so limited. You could have been me.
Instinctively, Vivian plunged into the shadows, pulling herself free as the arms went slack. But this was no easy escape. With reality on the brink, this realm was no longer a unified darkness. Instead, it looked like someone had taken a hammer to a sheet of black glass. Her double was atop her in seconds, pinning her to the outer edge of a fragment.
You've been weak since the day you stepped into the light.
The ensuing struggle was a brief one, because something happened that made Vivian freeze in terror. There was a loud crack, and then suddenly the bubble of darkness was falling. While the sirens had fought, their piece of the pavement had collapsed, and now both of them were trapped inside a rock, adrift on the ravenous void. As the current buffeted them, Vivian squirmed free and made a break for the surface. But the doppelganger caught her by the tail, and jerked her straight back into the darkness.
"Can we please stop fighting?"
she cried, aware of the moments until their prison began to erode.
"Use your shadow hands to pull us ashore, or else we'll both die in here."
The other siren brushed her off, clearly having the time of her wretched life.
"Don't be silly, this magic can't kill us," she sang, before breaking down into those false giggles that made Vivian's skin crawl. "We're one with the darkness, you and me. Or have you still not figured out the truth about our birth?"
Vivian was confused. What truth was there to know? She had been born just like every other shadow siren, alone and unloved at the bottom of a pit. But unlike the rest, she had emerged long after the Shadow Queen's empire had fallen.
"Sis said that I'm just a mistake,"
she muttered, refusing to let those long-dried tears come again. She closed her eyes, recalling the cruel and vulgar way that her sister had phrased it. According to Beldam, the spawning pits had finally pooled enough ambient magic to
crap out one last siren.
She had called Vivian an ugly defect, the afterbirth of a spell that hadn't functioned properly for nearly 1,000 years.
"Our birth wasn't a mistake, it was providence,"
the duplicate said, with a faraway smile that almost looked wistful.
"The darkness itself made us, to restore the old kingdom."
She suddenly lashed out, pinning Vivian to the wall once more. Her expression held something dangerous, far beyond whatever madness she had let slip up until now.
"Yeah, you and I, we're the Shadow Queen come again."
This time, Vivian was speechless. The theory made so little sense that she didn't know which thread to pull first. To start with, the Shadow Queen had still been alive back then, albeit sealed away. But her counterpart took advantage of the silence to keep rambling.
"We're her legacy, and her successor. How else do you explain the powers I have? No siren has ever been able to control the shadows like I can, except for her."
Her skills were a true anomaly, but nothing more, and Vivian needed to make her understand.
"If we're like her, then why can't I do those things?"
The enemy said nothing, but hissed and flinched like an animal under the whip.
"Trust me, I get it. You've been hurt, so you felt like you needed a purpose to make sense of it all. But, the truth is that the truth is what I believe it is."
The doppelganger shrieked, shoving Vivian against the shadowy wall with enough force to crack the boulder itself. Vivian tried to escape, but this time it was useless. Her foe was relentless, and desperate to be heard.
"You can't take this from me. I won't let you make those years of isolation meaningless."
Through the haze and the fear, Vivian's mind lingered on the word years. In her own life, she had wandered the pits for a few weeks before her sisters had found her. Beldam used to make routine sweeps of the underground palace, or had things been different in this timeline?
"I can't even imagine that kind of loneliness."
She knew the result well enough, though, because it was floating right in front of her. Vivian had evidently struck a very deep nerve, because her double's outburst was turning into a rant.
"I lived in blackness for years, gnawing on rats and bones. There were nights I cried for help, but nobody ever came.
Tears were flowing now, warm and unbidden.
Sure, the old hag showed up eventually, but by then it was far too late for us to be sisters.
Years of awful memories flashed by in the siren's eyes.
She led me to the surface, but it was just more gloom and decay. In the end, she sold me to a circus, and they gave me to Kamek, like I was some creature to be traded without consent.
She shuddered in silence for a moment, while the storm raged on outside.
It was humiliating, but I endured it all, because I knew that one day I'd be queen.
Just then, without warning, her hold on Vivian tightened to a vice grip.
But then there's you,
she spat with a sneer of total disgust.
I can only imagine how you felt, leaving that cavern to see a sky filled with stars.
Suddenly, those many comments about weakness seemed to take on a new shade of meaning.
I'll bet they were so lovely, weren't they? You must be even awestruck, and it made you forget your purpose.
For an awful moment, the crazed siren looked ready to strike. But instead, she seemed to deflate. With a racked sob, faux Vivian's web of self-told lies began to come undone, unraveling under the weight of so much pain.
They must have been so beautiful.
She whimpered, not with the voice of a deranged fanatic, but with that of a bitterly jealous young woman.
It makes me want to claw your eyes out, for seeing such things.
So many questions had been raised with just a few words. Had she ever truly believed in the darkness dogma she had been spouting all this time? Maybe she was just trying to find a place for herself in a very bleak world. Either way, Vivian needed to set the story straight.
That's not how it happened.
She softly began, continuing only when her other self didn't reply.
When I first saw the surface, it was the starriest night you could possibly imagine.
There had been millions of them, galaxies and constellations, and a winter white moon so bright that half the horizon had been bathed in its glow. It was the kind of night that could inspire a generation of dreamers, but...
I looked up at all of those stars swirling overhead.
She sighed, preparing to share a secret that had always been hers alone.
And I felt nothing.
The faux siren gasped, a strangled and disbelieving thing, but this was no lie.
They weren't beautiful,
Vivian continued,
they were just... there. One more thing in the background of a world I didn't understand.
She had eventually learned about wishes, but those had never seemed to work for her.
Maybe I took it for granted, but to me the sky felt empty, even when it was supposed to be full.
It was getting harder to speak. Either because she was flustered, or because the boulder had shrunk to the point where there wasn't much room left to breathe.
It wasn't until I met Mario that it all made sense.
There had been initial mistrust, awkwardness, but then...
We spent a night on the back of a train, just talking. The stars were out, and... I felt it. For the first time ever, I understood.
She was rambling, like always, but her winding words led somewhere important.
I think I'm the only one that realizes it, but this world isn't dying because the stars are gone.
Their death had been a harsh blow, and the Empress a harsher consequence, but it was despair, not the cosmos, that had ultimately doomed this kingdom.
The truth is,
she pressed on, each word its own battle,
that the lights out there in the sky don't mean a thing. They're cold and distant, and you can strive your whole life to reach them but never get there.
She glanced up at Mario, her hero, still clinging bravely to the ice.
In the end, all that matters is the light we have inside.
Her duplicate looked appalled, but Vivian didn't blame her. She put a reassuring hand on the other siren's chest.
It's inside you too, and it's not weakness. It's love, and it's the greatest strength there is.
This was it, a chance to put past miseries behind them for good.
You don't have to like me, or respect the life I've lived, but please, Don't extinguish that light. It'll make you just like Beldam.
Saying her sister's name had been a bad idea, because it triggered a primal fury in her alternate self. In a heartbeat, the lunatic siren was in her face, and at her throat, screaming and throttling with blind abandon. Shadowy fingers ripped at Vivian from the darkness, and her air-starved flames were powerless to fend them off. Her struggling slowed, the world grew muted, and then...
"You're not alone anymore,"
Mario had said that night on the Excess Express. The night she had fallen for him. She could see his face so clearly. His caring eyes, and the way the breeze teased his mustache. The stars lit the background, but they blurred as Vivian's mind grew hazy.
"You might not believe in yourself yet, but that's okay, because I'll always believe in you. I'll believe in you,"
Vivian repeated weakly, sinking into the black static of suffocation. She could feel tears on her cheeks, but didn't know whose they were. She heard the distant peal of the creepy steeple bell, and the whistling of the train, and the sound of fireworks at the Starlight Gala.
"Always, because,"
she whispered, with the last of her breath.
"You're not alone."
Something flashed in the other siren's eyes. Maybe confusion, or perhaps clarity. Some impossible mix of the two. The pressure eased, and her trembling hands pulled away.
What did you say?"
Vivian fell limply against the barrier, but her reflexes kicked in, and soon she was gasping for breath, shaking like a leaf as her senses surged back. Her reflection held her by the shoulders, not out of malice, but out of a desperate fear that she might have heard wrong.
"No one has ever said,"
she ventured, but deep-seated paranoia drew her back.
This isn't some kind of foul trick, is it?" "It turns out we're very similar,"
Vivian answered, pulling herself together enough to offer a small smile. Truthfully, she had barely been aware of her words, but even now, with a clearer head, she couldn't bring herself to doubt them.
"Mario once asked me to believe in myself, so I will, although I don't think this is quite what he had in mind."
Her other self remained quiet, lost in a war of indecision. Finally, with her usual erratic quickness, she grabbed Vivian's wrist and began to swim upwards, out of the shadows and back onto the boulder. The gale nearly swept them away, but their tails managed to keep them tethered. The faux siren summoned her hands, and Vivian watched as they began to tear at the rock, clawing and breaking until the stone split cleanly in two. Each broken piece held a siren, and the snarl of shadowy limbs kept them together. For one sickening instant, Vivian believed that her half was going to be capsized. But then the hands were lifting her, and her double was gazing off toward the iceberg.
"Love and light,"
she said as Vivian's stone began to swing. The arms were spinning it. Round and round, faster and faster like an old-fashioned sling.
"If it's all so important, then we'd better not miss."
Just like that, the hands turned loose, and Vivian held on fiercely as her broken stone blazed across the sky. She saw the frozen Empress rushing nearer, but she wasn't going to hit it. She was going to soar straight past it, close enough that Mario could jump aboard.
"Mario, I'm here,"
the siren called, praying that her voice carried above the storm.
"Turn around, please. You have to."
At the sound of her voice, Mario did a full double take.
"Mamma mia, Vivian! What are you doing here?"
he yelled, but when she gave the signal to jump, he wasted no time. The hero tucked in his legs, then pushed off from the glacier, launching himself into a triumphantly powerful leap of faith. And missed, utterly and awfully. Maybe it was the wind's fault, or the slipperiness of the ice, or the echo of Mario's old spear wound. Either way, his flight path wasn't leading him toward the boulder, but rather the emptiness it had occupied seconds earlier. For an instant, his shocked eyes met Vivian's. They both knew what this meant, and it was far too late for either to change their course. But then, in her panic, a single shadowy arm burst from the stone, snagging Mario in midair and delivering him to safety. She turned to thank her double for the assist, but Faux Vivian was nowhere to be seen, lost somewhere on the far side of the iceberg.
"Was that me?"
she asked, stunned by the sight.
But no siren has those powers, except..."
With a shake of her head, she dismissed the thought. Those were worries for another lifetime. The remainder of this one, however brief, would be spent by Mario's side. They sailed through the air in each other's arms, skimming across the darkness, towards an unknown landing and a perilous future. Meanwhile, back atop the last remaining spires, Luigi and Bao were still trapped in their showdown with Kamek. It wasn't so much a battle, though, as a sadistic and flashy gauntlet of fear. Luigi leapt over a fireball, then flung himself forward as it boomeranged back overhead. Kamek's attacks had no pattern, and his tactics grew more unhinged with each passing minute. He had taken to warping along the handrails, striking gargoyle poses as he spammed an endless barrage of spells. To make things worse, pieces of the bridge were still flip-swapping at random, so there was no place to pause and catch a breath. Bao floated up above, trying to provide some kind of air support. Her weariness had faded, but she still lamented having sacrificed her flower powers. If she still had them, then perhaps this fight would be over by now. Instead, she dived down to strafe Kamek with slaps, drawing his fury just long enough for Luigi to get back on his feet. Recovering quickly, Luigi prepared to rush his enemy, but the platform between them shivered, and he drew up short before it flipped out from underneath him.
"Is this your best effort?"
the Magic Koopa taunted, cackling at the hero's feeble attempts to pin him down. He warped to a new vantage, firing a spray of magic pellets that filled the air like bees.
"With protectors like you, I'm surprised your world didn't end years ago."
Bao went intangible as tiny blasts peppered the field around her.
"There's no choice, we simply have to get that wand,"
she thought, eyeing the scepter as Kamek used it to direct the assault. This was no time to sit back and observe, not when it fell on her to turn the tide.
"Will he still be smug once I've smacked his toy away?"
She flew to the right in a wide arc, making sure that Kamek saw her before she turned invisible. The mage began firing erratically in her direction, which meant the feint had succeeded. Swift and unseen, the ghost swooped beneath the bridge, rising up behind the enemy with a swish of her fan. Luigi was hopping around and waving his arms about something, but this chance was too perfect to miss. Bao put on her scariest face, revealed herself, and slapped the mage with as much strength as she could muster. But she passed right through him, and then the wizard's image flickered away. She barely had time to think,
it was a decoy,
before a magic blast struck her in the side. The world shattered, and her thoughts along with it. Suddenly Bao was falling, and then she wasn't, and then she was again, but not by herself. Somebody was yelling, someone else was laughing, and life shrunk to a blur of wind and pain. There was a small jolt, and it spurred one last moment of lucidity. Bao looked up, because that's all she could do, and saw herself and Luigi in peril. He had caught the stunned Boo as she fell, but their segment of the bridge had inverted, and now he was hanging from the rail by his fingertips. Kamek, the real one this time, edged into view from the side, grinning like a maniac as he watched his win play out. Lady Bao, in all her years of death, had never felt so precariously, fragilely alive. As her sight faded, she gazed past Luigi and glimpsed a single star, pale pink and far away.
"That's not a star,"
she thought as consciousness left her.
"Why, it almost looks like..."
In the last few minutes, the maelstrom's hunger had increased tenfold. It was like something within the curse had awoken, because suddenly the rift was spreading like floodwater, chewing apart the streets faster than Mario and Vivian could flee. They scrambled through the rubble together, fighting to outpace the collapse. Guiding each other, they threaded their way between space-time gaps that sheared open on every side. Behind them, the sound of cracking ice echoed through the storm. The sticker's magic had been all but spent, and now the Empress was beginning to thaw.
Was it really all for nothing?
Mario wondered, glancing backward as he ran. One of the frozen tendrils twitched, shedding a layer of icicles into the void. Just then, the pavement underfoot split away from the road. Mario leapt the gap without thinking, but his stomach turned when he heard Vivian scream. He spun around and grabbed her hand, but it was a hopeless gesture. The debris was caught in the current, and the siren was unable to jump.
"It's no use, you need to leave me behind,"
she said, wincing as her tail stretched to its absolute limit. But letting go was never an option, especially not here, when their future had just begun. Vivian had unlocked new powers, but she hadn't mastered them yet, and they couldn't be relied on to save her. That left only one course of action.
"You can detach yourself, right?"
Mario had seen her do it once before, on their first adventure, although it hadn't exactly been pleasant.
"I know it'll hurt, but please, Viv, you have to try."
She looked at him, eyes wide, as if his request was more terrifying than certain death. For an instant, he felt her hand begin to slip away, but then she nodded and held on tighter. She gasped sharply as the tension increased. But then it was gone, and Vivian was wrestling toward him, fully untethered and paling rapidly. She fell against him as she landed, letting out a breathless chuckle as he helped her reconnect. But her little victory didn't last, because the sidewalk broke around them, and the heroes were cast back into the stream before either could react. Mario bolted upright, preparing to escape with another jump, but Vivian shied out of his grasp, looking utterly fatigued.
"I see you can't do that again, Mario. I'm sorry, but this time you have to go alone."
The hero hesitated, watching the shoreline as it continued to ebb away from him. He could still make this leap, still reach safety, but where would life lead him from there?
Please, just leave me here."
Vivian wept, nudging him toward the precipice with what little strength she still had.
"It hurts so much to say goodbye, but it's time. Go save Luigi, and Princess Peach. You can be happy with them. With her."
But that wasn't true, was it? In another life, in another world, perhaps it could have been. But here, Mario had made a choice, and more importantly, he had made a promise. If this was how his game finally ended, then he could accept it. But not until he had done one very last, vital thing. With a desperate need, he turned away from the chasm, gathered Vivian back into his arms, and captured her lips with his own. The shadow stiffened at first, blindsided, but when her mind reached the present, she returned the kiss with long years' worth of need. Mario never knew how much he had craved her scent, her softness. His fingers entwined with her sugar-spun hair, while her hands found his shoulders and pulled him in, fiercely, close enough to feel the wanting flutter of her heart. She inched away to dry her tears, taking quick sips of breath that tickled his mustache, but soon returned to him for more. The hurricane clawed at them both, but to the hero and his siren, there was no storm, no threat, no fear. Nothing was real except for them, the warmth of their skin, and the light that mixed within their souls. Still holding each other, they never even noticed as the vortex lagged, pitched over itself, and began to spin backwards. Time and space clashed, screamed, and traded places. Somewhere, across years and worlds and memory, 8 hearts beat as the tides of chaos churned, unwound, and swept the lovers away. This had to be it, the end of the world. The winds rose and thunder roared, and Luigi's strength, why was it never enough? Was leaving him fast. He hung from the bridge by his left hand, while cradling Bo's still form with his right. If he had had both hands free, then maybe he could have pulled himself up, yet despite the burden, he'd never think of risking Bo's safety. She was a boo, and a prankster, a little bit lazy, and sometimes quite rude. But she had also been loyal and selfless, and had given unwavering support since the very start. Luigi had done his share of giving up, but no matter what, he refused to abandon a friend. His thumb slipped, but his eyes were drawn to a curious scene unfolding in the streets below. Some of the rifts were starting to close, spasmodically, as if the gears of a clock had been thrown into reverse. Was someone down there trying to cast a counterspell?
It's too little, too late,
Luigi thought, watching as the portals bled into each other, refilling the space left behind.
Nothing can break the curse while Kamek is still breathing.
The mage surveyed the new events, briefly, before losing interest.
It's time to wrap this up,
he said, claws clicking unevenly as he limped across the stone. He paused above the hero, hunched forward and grinning, spectacles gleaming in the light of his wand.
You're about to die, Luigi. Aren't you going to scream for me?
But Luigi stayed silent, keeping his fears inside. His other self had been too scared to fight back, but that little boy wasn't him. The least he could do, here at the end, was look his enemy in the eyes.
Is this your idea of bravery?
The villain hissed, twitching in frustration.
You think you can pretend like things have changed?
He aimed his wand at Luigi's face, charging up a blast as he snarled.
I'm still the one in control. It's always been me. I want to hear you scream.
Kamek never spoke another word. An energy bolt struck him in the back, knocking the scepter from his hand. The wizard sagged sideways, stunned, until a metallic thwong knocked him forward and over the edge. He fell past Luigi with a swish of his cloak, and then he was gone. Up above, 2 faces peered down from the bridge. One pretty and blonde, the other old and haggard. Kami Koopa was the first to speak.
Like I said earlier, he always was a disappointment.
Princess Peach set her frying pan aside, then bent down to help the struggling heroes. Luigi passed bow to her, and then accepted her hand as he hoisted himself to safety.
Thanks a lot, Princess,
he said, arms still shaking as he flopped down between his rescuers. Kami had already begun tending to bow, while Peach stood up and dusted herself off.
But I don't get it, what are you two doing here?
Peach glanced down at the iron pan, then offered a shrug and a coy smile.
Bowser sent me to the kitchens, so I grabbed that and came back to fight.
She paused, catching sight of Kamek, reduced to a speck and still plummeting.
You don't think he'll get a soft landing, do you?
Luigi doubted it very much. After all, the rifts had pulled back, and there was pavement below. The wizard fell and fell, until at last, with a sickening splat, the spell was broken. A white flash, pitch darkness. Grave silence and discord, earthquakes, and total stillness. Somehow, impossibly, all of this happened at once, but then it passed, and Vivian was sitting on a rock in the middle of ashen nowhere. She pushed her tangled bangs out of her eyes, blearily taking in the state of her surroundings. Nearby, Mario groaned as he sat up, rubbing his temples to clear away the dizziness. Vivian felt herself blush at the sight of him, recalling how they had spent their supposed last moments.
I think it's finally over,
she said, scooting closer as the wind stirred circles in the dust between them.
Well, wait, I didn't just jinx us by saying that, did I?
Mario chuckled, the weariness falling from his face.
Not this time. I think we really made it through,
he said, turning his head to scan the horizon. Of Empress Shrub's palace, nothing remained but a vast lunar plain, pockmarked by craters and the occasional fang of twisted metal. Mario and Vivian sat at the edge of a stadium-sized basin, the Maelstrom's scar, which sloped away in fractal spirals of ash, down to the Empress herself. Or rather, the half of her that still remained. The alien, already a fetid mountain in life, had outdone herself in death. She had been half sunken through the void, and its closing had severed her cleanly in two. Limp hyphae lay about the field, bloated like earthworms drowned in the rain. Half of a jaw hung open, drooling bile through a scream, beneath the sightless gaze of one milky red eye.
If only we had managed to stop her before she caused so much damage,
Mario muttered, looking far into the distance where Mushroom City had stood. It was gone, and its essence spilled, but hadn't the world still been saved? The wasteland seemed endless, but Vivian knew that beyond it lay trees and fields, farms and towns, people who hadn't come to the ill-fated festival. People who would never have to live in fear of the Empress again. She was about to say so, but then a familiar shape caught her eye. There was someone in the pit, barely visible beside the corpse, but Vivian soon recognized her alternate self. The siren was wandering along, poking and prodding at the beast. When she reached its face, she began to laugh, and all the darkness seemed to melt away. It wasn't crazed or tortured laughter, not anymore, it just sounded so relieved. Meanwhile, atop the silent swells of flesh, a small light began to shine. A wisp of starlight, pink and delicate, lingered on the beast like a lost child.
It's her,
Vivian realized as a chill went through her.
The princess, the little soul from before.
Timidly, as if unsure of her steps, the wraith began to sway and spin, swept into a dance that only she could follow. And then, one by one, the others appeared. 6 souls in a medley of shades. 2 yellow, 2 green, a brown, and a red. They faded into view, twirling to the same silent elegy, as if they had been there all along. Vivian didn't quite grasp what was happening, but she felt Mario tremble when the red wisp glanced back their way. The siren took her hero's hand, and together they watched the spectacle unfold. The pink wisp took her place in the circle, graciously, and the 7 starry souls began to rise. Higher and faster, spiraling into the sky like a varicolored carousel of light. They pierced the golden mist, and it trailed after them like sand running backwards up an hourglass. A galaxy of lost souls, following the promise of a purpose. The parade of lights ascended, melded, gathered at the very edge of sight, and then a pulse, a soft sigh of the wind, and there they were. Stars, white and new, were beginning to wink awake like fireflies. 2 or 3 at first, then a dozen, and then a twinkling veil that spread itself across the heavens. The stars wavered, found their places, learned their fire, and began to truly shine. They smiled in their shimmery way, bringing life to the night for the first time in 20 years. Mario watched the sky in a trance of wonder.
It's a miracle,
he breathed, smiling brighter with each new star.
The cycle of stardust never repeats itself in quite the same way.
He said it wistfully, as if he had heard the words somewhere before.
They've been reborn, and with their help, then maybe this world can finally start to heal.
Vivian watched the stars too, but only as a reflection in Mario's eyes.
We shouldn't ask so much of such small lights,
she said, looking down at her other self, who had collapsed on her back in a fit of giggles. For the very first time, they sounded truly, blessedly real.
But still, I think everything here is going to be all right.
She leaned against him, and felt his arm encircle her waist. There was still much to do, and more to say, but it could wait until the morning. For now, they were content to lose themselves in stargazing, side by side at the edge of a new beginning. End of chapter.